and welcome to this, our 74th live stream. Who are you? What do you want? This is, of course, a double homage. First of all, it's an homage to Babylon 5, and if you're not aware of that science fiction series, it's a classic. It's a classic from the 1990s. And the two sort of forces that are at play will ask the people, well, who are you? What do you want? And there's no real good answer to that question. So it's a very, very interesting science fiction series if you ever get a chance to view it. And it is being remade, so it's going to come back into sort of the fore of the popular culture in the near future. The other thing is, this is also a sort of a tip of the hat of my Monday video where we did an introduction video basically discussing who we are. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do so. Because we talk about, about something we don't actually talk about all that much, which is ourselves. So we are just going to get into the questions now, and you'll also notice that there is a poll up, and we'll probably discuss the results of that poll at the end of it. And again, the rules are the same as always. Super chats have priority, but we also take non-super chats. And if you're going to give a non-super chat, basically ask a question. We ask that you put a Q and a colon in front of the question so I know that it's addressed to me personally, not to someone else in the live chat. We also ask that you only post the question once. Okay? And that's so I can sort of track where everything is, because I'm scanning through the live chat looking for unique questions. So if you post that question multiple times, I'm going to get confused, and that's not going to be good for anyone. So we ask that you only post your question once. And finally, if it has to do with a verse in the Bible or a foreign word, we ask that you give a little bit of context. In the case of a Bible verse, we ask that you include the book of the Bible, the chapter, and the verse. And in the case of a word in the foreign language, we also ask that you tell me what you think the word means and what language it's in, just so I have a little bit of context to go on. Okay. So with that said, let's start getting into the questions. And we have actually got several non-super chats to start with, so let's get into it. Okay, our first non-super chat tonight is from Maoist Tanky, and he asks, do you know any books that talk about the view that Asherah was a consort of Yahweh? Does Jeremiah refer to her as the Queen of Heaven if she's not a goddess? Well, we're not exactly, I don't think Jeremiah actually refers to her as Queen of Heaven. Let me just take a look at that just to be sure. I mean, yeah, Jeremiah does not talk about it explicitly. The Queen of Heaven, there is a Queen of Heaven that's often called Balat. And Balat is not the same as Asherah. Now, Balat is essentially the female counterpart to Baal, which is the Canaanite storm deity. In the case of Asherah, that's a little more complicated, because it's not always clear whether Asherah is a goddess or a particular practice. This is sort of a similar quandary that we find ourselves doing with Moloch. Is Moloch a god, or is this the child sacrifice offering? It's hard to say. And in the case of Moloch, we now side more towards that it's the offering, not a particular god. Well, Asherah has sort of the similar thing. For example, in Deuteronomy 16:21, it says, "You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord your God." This seems to indicate that Asherah is not a consort, but a kind of votive practice, essentially a ritual log. A very similar practice was found in Egypt with the Osiris fetish, which is basically a big log. Now, what makes this sort of a little less clear is we do find in, say, Ugaritic mythology the idea that Asherah was a goddess and consort to other gods. So Ugaritic mythology here sort of muddies the waters. It really muddies the waters. So there are several books that are written on this. I don't have the names of them off the top of my head, but many people have written books. Here's the thing I find very problematic about these books too. Is they do seem to often rely upon copious amounts of speculation and inference. The fact is, we are not dealing with a lot of data here. We're dealing with sort of, tidbits from scraps. We're dealing with scraps of evidence. We've got a few scraps from Ugarit. We've got the Tel Ajrud ostraca, where it talks about Yahweh and his Asherah. And even in that, it's not really clear what that Asherah is. So we're not exactly sure what role Asherah is playing in all of this. We do know it's a forbidden practice in Israelite culture. We don't know, though, if it's a one-to-one correlation with the so-called Queen of Heaven. We do know that, like, for example, in Egyptian myth, like, for example, at the Alfantini papyri, the Queen of Heaven is actually a reference to the Egyptian goddess Mut, who is explicitly called the Lady of Heaven. Okay? So the Lady of Heaven, or the Queen of Heaven, can take on various identities. It's almost a job description, much more than it is a name of a specific goddess. So we got to keep all of this in mind when we come to the whole idea of what is Asherah, what's the Queen of Heaven, because they are distinctly different things. Okay? So without getting into more detail here, that's probably where we will leave it off. But anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. It has a lot of ramifications on ancient Canaanite customs and religion. But we're also, again, dealing with scraps, with evidential scraps, and having to make inferences from those scraps. So, thank you very much for the question. Okay, our next question is from... Okay, I'm going to try to pronounce this right this week. The camelopard. We like camelopard. I mean, it is from that same etymology, but it is the camelopard. And he asked them from the question I asked him to repost. What is your favorite thing or something wish more people knew about the Book of Malachi? Okay. Now, I did read through the Book of Malachi this week. I think one of the things is the overall theme. The overall theme of Malachi. And I think that is really important. I think if you get the overall theme of Malachi correct, then the rest sort of takes care of itself. And the overall theme of Malachi seems to be come back to basically orthopraxis. right practice. You know, Malachi begins with a discussion of what's an appropriate sacrifice to the Lord. You know, don't sacrifice your spotted lamb or your blind lamb or your lamb missing a leg. Okay? You know, only appropriate offerings are acceptable to the Lord. Then moves on to, okay, don't be treacherous with your spouse. Bring the full offering to the temple. You know, these are basic principles of orthopraxis. Basically, what Malachi is saying through the whole thing is God's not to be trifled with. You know, if you want to worship God, well, you got to worship him God's way. Okay, that's basically what it's boiling down to. And I think if you get just that essence out of it, that you can't mess with God. You know, you can't fool him. He's going to know. Okay? He's going to know that, hey, you divorce your wife and you threaten to beat her at the same time. God's going to know this. Basically, Malachi is saying that the true believers in God are going to do things God's way. And everyone else is just a pretender. You know? That's something that's still relevant. Even in the New Testament period. You know, Malachi is not advocating for Torah observance. It's advocating for living Torah. That's a different thing. It's not asking you to observe every peccadillo of the law. What it's asking you to do is to live in the spirit of the law and in the spirit of righteousness. And I think if people knew that, if they took just that away from the book of Malachi, that would be just a tremendous thing right there. Keep your word. Keep your word. Keep your covenants. You know, give God your best. You know, it's the summation of the two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and all your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. For these are the two and greatest commandments. That's essentially what Malachi is striving for. So if you just take that away from Malachi, the rest is just gravy. Really. It's really, really just gravy after that. So focus on that. You know, focus on this is living Torah, which is exactly what Christ is advocating. He's advocating living Torah. Again, you're living the spirit of the law, not necessarily every peccadillo, not every little jot and tittle of it. So this isn't legalism. This is living by its spirit, and showing through your actions God's righteousness in you. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. Thank you for reposting that. It's a worthy question. Again, I needed the time to read Malachi to catch up on this, but that's what I think people need to take away from Malachi. So anyway, yeah, it might seem a little obvious, but sometimes the obvious needs to be stated. Okay? So, thank you very much for the question. Very, very much appreciate that. Okay, our next question is from Darkblade. And he asks, what would the religious system of Egypt have looked like during Joseph's tenure? Ooh, interesting question. And how would it have been affected by the fact that someone of Joseph's religious perspective was vizier? Okay. This is an interesting question. That's interesting for several reasons. I'll answer the second one first. I don't think Joseph's religious perspective as vizier would have affected the religious system of Egypt very much. Very, 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 very bluntly. We have to understand that what Joseph is walking into here is an Amorite Semitic kingdom in the Delta region of Egypt. Okay? They have already established there is a temple of Baal and Resheph worship and Astarte worship. People are already worshiping Canaanite deities there. Okay? In many respects, worship there is already very henotheistic. The kings of Avaris of the Hyksos dynasty were essentially henotheists. They basically worshipped Baals to the exclusion of other gods. Even though the average person on the street also worshipped other deities, as I said, like Resheph and Astarte, and even some Egyptian deities. So when Joseph is coming in, he's sort of walking into what's already an established religious system. So the temple is already there. The temple of Baal is already extant. It's already in operation. It's already accepting sacrifices. It already has a priesthood. I doubt that Joseph would have had much impact on that at all as somebody who worshipped Yahweh. So what probably happened more likely was Joseph practiced his religion privately instead of trying to interfere with the state religion. Because the state religion was already functional. It was already in full swing. I don't think there was much that Joseph could have done to change that. But at the same time, too, I doubt that Joseph would have advanced it either. Joseph would have probably have been aware that Baal worship was not acceptable. Even though in Joseph's time, polytheism, or at least henotheism, was I'm not going to say more forgivable, but it wasn't completely outlawed. We have to remember, Joseph didn't have the Sinai covenant yet. He didn't have the Sinai covenant yet. Idolatry had not been banned. God had basically not told the Israelites, get rid of your gods. We see the episode of Jacob and Rebecca, stealing Laban's gods. Okay? So it wasn't quite banned yet. Although there would have been already, say, cultural divide between the sons of Jacob and, say, other Canaanite worship practices. So, anyway, I think that probably covers it as best as we can at this point. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting question. A very interesting question. They weren't polytheists in quite the same way as, say, the Egyptians, but they also weren't monotheists either. They were truly henotheists. Many equal gods, but you owe your allegiance to one of them. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. Our next question here is from Brick Creation, and he asks, "Hi, Dr. Falk. How much first century Roman history do we have? Some say a lot, some say not much. Are historians like Cassius Dio writing in 233 AD accurate? Where do they get their info for the first century?" Okay, well, one of the things is we have a lot of first century Roman historians. Right? We've got a glut of them. It's not like that there was no Roman historians in the first century AD. We got Suetonius, we've got Livy, we got Tacitus. We got actually a lot of historians from the first century. So, the historians of later centuries are often going to rely on those earlier historians. They're also going to rely on, say, records of the Senate. And we've got to keep that in mind, that the Senate kept a lot of records. The Roman Senate came up with a lot of records, and those were public. You could go to the libraries of Rome and you could read Roman records. So one of the things that we have that among, say, Roman historians that we don't, say, have in other cultures is public libraries. The Romans were huge believers in public libraries. Huh? Yeah, yay, Romans. So these public libraries were not just, libraries, they were archives. So you could go to a Roman library, you could take the proceedings of the Senate, and you could read them. They were public record. They were publicly available. So many of the historians were looking at those public records. A lot of them had access, as I said, to other historians. And, there was a lot of literature that they could fall back on. So, how accurate were they? Well, it varies, honestly. Some historians are very accurate. Some historians are like any historian. Some historians tend to shy away from speculation. Some historians just fall headfirst into his speculation and go, "Oh, this is a cool rumor I heard." Okay. So it's going to, yeah. So it's going to depend. So it's going to depend on the historian. We do find that in some ages, some historians are more sober than in others. Some of that comes from the fact that they might have been, say, more how do I say this? Dire consequences if you don't tell the truth. Like the historians of the first century, they had to be a bit more sober because they're writing in a more contemporary frame. So if they said something that was too scandalous and not supported, they could end up in Galatia. And for Romans, Galatia is not the place you want to end up. Okay? That's where people got exiled from Rome, as Ovid found out. So, there's a limit to how far these historians could go. But I think a lot of them were very accurate. A lot of them could tell a lot of what was going on. And again, many of them are talking about, say, the royal family and scandals in their past. So, again, they have to be tactful about this. But many of them are very accurate. Many of them are relying on court records. So, in many cases, I would trust what they would say. Some cases, I'd be more critical and skeptical. So it's going to really depend on a case-by-case basis. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it. It's an interesting question. And our final non-super chat here for the moment is from Spectre. And he asks, if the Son is equal to the Father, then how come Christ prayed to the Father? Okay. This boils down to the notion of kenosis. Okay. Basically, I think it is in the book of Colossians, where it is said, Christ emptied himself of his divine attributes to become man. Now, basically, this means the idea of kenosis comes from the word meaning to empty. to empty oneself. So Christ sets aside his divine attributes, his omnipotence, his omniscience. Those that give him a superhuman advantage. Okay. Also, in that kenosis is that idea that he can, have that direct first person of the Trinity versus second person of the Trinity, say, shared mind. So Christ is basically having to communicate to God through prayer. Now, also, some of this is a parabolic act. And by what we mean by parabolic act is Christ is praying to the Father so we can hear it, so we can listen in on it, so we can learn from it. So this is why that even though the persons of the Trinity are equal, Christ, in his human pre-crucifixion ministry, we have to be very, very nuanced about this. This is taking place before the resurrection. After the resurrection, Christ picks up again his divine attributes, his omniscience, his omnipotence, and his hypostatic connection between him and the Father. So this is all going to boil down to, what does it mean for Christ to be fully God and fully man in his incarnation, in his pre-resurrection ministry? After that, he then picks up all those attributes again, and then is one with the Father. So it is going to be one of those things where, we have to take into account that he is becoming one like us, fully man. Christ he's fully God. He doesn't cease to be God at the incarnation, but he becomes more like us. He puts himself in our place. He puts himself in our place to have solidarity with us. So he can, be like us, feel like us, go through our struggles. So when we struggle, we have to pray to the Father. So when Christ struggled, he also had to pray to the Father. When he's on the cross, as paying for the sins of mankind, he has to scream out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's that kenosis of the divine attributes that makes him fully man. And yet he is also fully God. It is a divine mystery, but it is one we have to engage and have to wrestle with. So anyway, I hope that answered your question, or at least provided more insight into it. Thank you very much for the question. It is a very, very interesting and very fundamental question. So I appreciate that question. Okay, now let's turn to the super chats. Our first super chat is from the Camelopard for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on John 7:53 to 8:11 being in the Bible? Okay. Text critics are pretty much agreed at this point on this one. And what I mean by text critics is New Testament text critics. which is that John 7:53 to 8:11 is not in the oldest manuscripts, not even by a long shot. It does seem to enter into Byzantine texts, and it does seem to be a relatively a later edition. I'm not exactly sure when it comes in, but basically the text critics are saying it's not original to the earliest manuscripts of the Bible. You know, you're not going to find this in. I don't believe it is in Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus. I don't even think it's in some of the early Western text types. It does seem to be an addition to the Byzantine text types, but text critics are pretty much like 99% agreed that this is not original, the New Testament documents. And unless I have some better evidence to say otherwise, I would sort of agree with them here. Because unlike Old Testament text criticism, which tends to be a little more, well, you gotta tolerate a lot more ambiguity as an Old Testament text critic. New Testament text criticism is usually pretty cut and dry on most of this stuff. So if a New Testament critic says, hey, you know, this is not in the original manuscript, probably not in the original manuscript. So there's a lot you can have a lot higher trust threshold here for when a majority of New Testament text critics say, hey, this is not original. And from everything I've seen, John 7:53 to 8:11 is not original. So that's sort of my opinion on this. I don't think it's original to the text. I have no reason to think it's original to the text. All our oldest manuscripts seem to say it's just not there. So, and frankly, I don't have a view of, say, the New Testament documents where I see either Textus Receptus or Byzantine texts as being text primacy. Okay, so because I don't have that view, I'm just not gonna die on the hill saying that this is original. The story still could be true, though, to be honest. The story that's included here could have been one of those stories that has sort of, we do get a few stories that are added. I'm not saying going to add to the original text, but legends of Christ have sort of grown up alongside the Gospels. And it is possible that this is one of those legends about Christ that sort of grew up with the Gospels and then got included in, by a later scribe. A later scribe heard this, thought this should be here, thought this is the place to insert it and put it in there. I would be reticent, though, to consider that scripture. I don't think that's inspired text. It could be a legend, though. And it could be a legend, may or may not be true, who knows. But even if it is true, it may not be inspired. So I'm probably going to have to leave it right there. But I have my serious doubts. I don't think this is part of original text. It's not John's original text anyway. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Our next super chat is also from the Camelopard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is the relation between Sheol, Abaddon, and Shakot? Are all names for the same concept or subsidiaries of some kind? Ooh. Yeah, in 5 minutes or less. This is a complicated question. Wow. There is actually a lot going on here under the cover, and how do I even unfold this in 3 to 5 minutes? It's just okay. Well, let's take a stab at it. We're not even going to touch even the intricacies of this one, but we're going to take a stab at this. Okay. Okay. Let's start by defining our terms. Sheol is the grave. This is the domain that the dead go to. You know, good dead, bad get dead, doesn't matter. You die, you go to Sheol. Okay. And Camel Leopard just commented new Monday video. Well, you know what? This is as complicated as we would use for a Monday video, honestly. Uh, it's that level of complexity. Now, Abaddon means to. It comes from the word abad, means to ruin. Abaddon is the intensive form of abad, destruction, ruin. Yeah, it's now Abaddon and Sheol are sometimes synonymous terms. Sometimes they're not. Context matters here. Context vary. Sheol is almost always the realm of the dead. Abaddon can sometimes be the realm of the dead. Okay? Abaddon can also refer to a destroying angel. So you get that reference too. So in as far as Abaddon refers to a place, it's really sort of talking about the bad side of the train tracks and Sheol. Now, we have to understand that Sheol in the Old Testament was divided into two compartments. That was divided by a gulf, which I tongue-in-cheek called the train tracks. You have Abraham's bosom on the one half. You had Hades, or the bad place, in the other half. Abaddon is that other place. It's the bad side of the train tracks. Okay? Now, Shakhat is different again. Shakhat is corruption. Corruption, this also can be a synonym for it can be a synonym for Sheol as well. But it can also just be sort of the corruption of the grave. You know, putrefaction. Okay. The fact is that in the case of Shakhat, people in both sides of Sheol could be in Shakhat. Both in Abraham's bosom and in, say, the bad side of the train tracks. Because Shakhat can also be, say, the corruption of just being dead. One of the things we have to understand about dead people in ancient Israel is they are ritually impure. You touch a corpse, you're now ritually impure. And if you want to go to do the temple rituals, you have to be ritually cleansed. Well, you know, if you died, you have touched the corpse. You touched yourself. You're now ritually impure by default. Yes, zombies are ritually impure. Hate to break that to you. Good to know. So every dead person is ritually impure because they touched a corpse themselves. And this is why everybody in Sheol is Shakhat. They have been touched by corruption. And they don't have a means to be ritually cleansed because they're dead. Okay? So you're beyond the hope of being ritually cleansed. So everybody who dies is ritually impure by definition. Now, of course, with Christ, those who are alive in Christ, are cleansed by Christ's righteousness. But this goes back to the meaning of what Shakhat is and how that applies to Sheol. Sheol is the repository of the dead who cannot go to heaven because they are either defiant, they're on the wrong side of the train tracks, or they're on the right side of the train tracks in Abraham's bosom, but they are corrupted by being a corpse. So, this is sort of the relationship then. You have Sheol, the grave. Everyone in the grave is Shakot. But some in Sheol are in Abaddon because they're ruined. They cannot escape that destruction. So they're similar and related concepts, but they're also slightly different too. There's different nuances here going on, and even sort of different different meanings of various things. I'm actually going to take this non-super chat here just for a second here because I think it's Lost in Victory commented here. That's why the Ottomans put a cemetery outside the East Gate in Jerusalem. Exactly. That's exactly why they put a cemetery outside the East Gate in Jerusalem. Because the return of Christ was said to be through the East Gate of Jerusalem, and Messiah, Christ, if he was ritually pure, couldn't cross over the dead corpses. The idea is that the ground has been made ritually impure. Yeah, it's very naive thinking. Very, very naive thinking. But indeed, that's why the Ottomans put that cemetery there. Okay? So, getting back to the super chat here. So yeah, so there's all, and that's sort of the broad sort of view here. Now we can get into all sorts of weeds here on what's the view of Sheol, how that changed over time, how the view of Abaddon changed over time, even how did the view of corruption, how is it treated, say, early on, say in Middle Hebrew versus in the Second Temple period, even that's going to change dramatically. Okay, so there's a whole lot of weeds we can get into here. So, but I think that goes beyond what we can do here in a live stream. But anyway, I want to thank you for that super chat. It's an interesting question, and wow, it does lead to some very, very interesting things. So thank you so much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Our next super chat is from 501 Mobius for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. And it's good to see you here tonight. I read that 2448 and Anno Monday AM 1330 BC is the traditional Exodus date in Orthodox Judaism. This puts it within 420 to 428 years of Hammurabi. Can archaeology show this? Years from the Battle of Sodom per Abraham. Can archaeology show this? Okay. Yes and no. It's a yes and no thing. It is true. I mean, if you add this up, 1313 plus, say, 420 years, that's 1733 BC. That's roughly, that is in Hammurabi's reign. Okay? So it is in that reign, definitely. So with that said, yes. Archaeology, basically the most recent chronologies, I guess. Let's put it this way. When I did the ancient Near Eastern chronology of through Groundhog, I put Hammurabi at his reign up here from between 1765 to 1722 BC. So that's definitely in the range. So definitely in the range of Hammurabi. So I think that is definitely something that can be confirmed by archaeology. And this roughly corresponds to the low Babylonian chronology. So insofar as the low chronology corresponds to this, absolutely. Now, here's the caveat. Here's the caveat, and here's the kicker. We got to keep in mind here is that Anno Monday dating is not very accurate, and we got to keep that in mind. It can be really inaccurate. We have to understand that Anno Monday dating, and there's more than one Anno Monday dating, but when we're talking about here is we're talking about Anno Monday dating of Judaism. You know, there's other AM dating as well, but Anno Monday dating places creation at 3760 BC. That's one Anno Monday. That is going to be a problem. You know, no matter how you cut it, that date is going to be a problem. You know, you're talking here, you know, in the, say, the Nagata 3 period of Egypt. That's going to be an issue. You know, Anno Monday dating places the flood in 2105 BC, basically 1655 Anno Monday. That's also going to be an issue. So, you know, when we finally get to the Exodus at 1313 BC or 2448 Anno Monday, there's going to be some accuracy issues. There's definitely some accuracy issues here. So, I'm always reticent to use Anno Monday dating. I mean, the only thing I can sort of take away from this, in all honesty, is that when I look at, say, Anno Monday dating for the Exodus, it does seem to lean a lot closer to the late date than the early date. Honestly. I mean, we are talking about 50 years away from the early Exodus date. That's a lot closer than the early date. A lot closer to the late date. So, I'm very... I don't like Anno Monday dating. It's developed... It develops very, very late in Judaic culture. This is not something that shows up in Judaic culture until, I would say, roughly first or second century BC. So it's really late. And we already know that by this point, there's some Jewish traditions that have entered into Jewish chronology that are really off. Really, really terribly off. So I'm very sort of skeptical about this approach. And I think we have to be very, very careful about how we use it. We almost have to treat this like a religious calendar more than a chronological calendar. Okay? So I think they tried to reconstruct it as best as they could at the time, but it's not necessarily the most accurate. And again, I'm cautious here. I'm very, very cautious here, because I know that when you sort of press it to its limits, it's going to break. But with that said, it is, you know, tracing that back to the years of Hammurabi, yeah, sure. It's at least viable. But then again, so is other dating as well. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and I hope that helped. Okay. Our next super chat is from the Camelopard for $5. I'm gonna keep falling into that. I'm so... It's such a cool name. Yeah, knowing it's a giraffe now makes it even worse. That doesn't make it better. That doesn't make it easier. Makes me think. I mean, that just elicits in my brain a camel and a leopard all in one. Okay, so that's going to be a hard habit to break, and I apologize profusely, but it is so cool still. Okay. And he asks, since Miriam, which is Mary, was related to Elizabeth, does that make her a Levite and Yeshua from both the tribe of Judah and Levi? Okay. It's a good question, and the immediate answer to this is no. It doesn't necessarily make her a Judite or an a Levite. In fact, you can't be both. The way tribal affiliation works for women, okay, we're talking about women here, is as soon as you marry into another tribe, you become that tribe. You cease being of that old tribe. This is how it works for women. So Elizabeth is of the tribe of Levite, not because of her descent, but because of the descent of her husband. Okay? Now, in the case of Mary, she is both a Judite by descent and by marriage. So she's a double Judite in a sense. But the marriage alone would have compelled her to abandon that old affiliation. So Elizabeth would have probably have been a Judite before, but she marries into a Levitical family. So that makes her a Levite by marriage. So that's how clan affiliation works for women. You're that old clan affiliation until you marry. And then you become a new one. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that answered the question. And yeah, it is one of those things where, you just you have to sort of, piece this, you have to parse this, you have to take it apart, and you have to say, okay, how does clan affiliation work? And what are their relationships at the time? Elizabeth was already married. She was married to a priest. Makes her a Levite. That doesn't necessarily make Miriam a Levite. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. The next super chat is from Cambrit for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Is Hebrews 2:13 quoting Isaiah 8:18? And if so, how is the verse being used? Is this a midrash? God bless. Well, God bless you also. This is going to be a complicated question. Let's pull up our Bible. Alrighty. And let's go to, first of all, to Hebrews 2. And we'll start at 17 here. And it is talking about the overall context of this is that here. It's again talking about the splendors of Christ. What he has done, how he has been appointed over the works of his hands, etc., etc. Verse 9, we do see him who is made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor. We get to verse 13. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God has given me. Okay, so there's an implication here that Christ is being given the children of God. Verse 14, since the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise also took part of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had power of death, that is, the devil, and might deliver those who, through fear of death, were subject to slavery all their lives. For assuredly he did not give help to the angels, but he gives help to the descendants of Abraham. Now this is going to get into the seed of Abraham. Verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things. Again, this is sort of coming back to the incarnation, the kenosis, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. And then we get to verse 18. We passed it. So verse 13, and again, I will put my trust in him, and behold, I and the children whom God had given me. So we see this, that Christ is the high priest, essentially, and the care of the children is put into his hand. And this is the children of God, basically the descendants of Abraham, spiritual and physical. Then we get to, let's leap over now to Isaiah 8. 8. And verse 3 is probably really important here. So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived to give birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him Mahar-Shalal-Hash-Baz, which means fast goes the spoils, essentially. Essentially, when during the Syrian-Ephraimite War, if the king had been faithful, trusted in God, he would have been given a sign. A woman would have conceived, given a child, and he would have been named Emmanuel. If he wasn't faithful and didn't completely trust in the Lord, he'd be given a sign called Mahar-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Essentially, basically, the treasures of the kingdom would be given to the Assyrians. Basically, Tiglath-Pileser III. Okay? So, this is basically, Isaiah 8 is talking about the aftermath here of the Syrian Ephraimite War. So then we start getting around, verse 6. Insomuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. They rejected God's promise here. And rejoice in Rezin, son of Ramaliah, who's the king of Aram, basically one of the big chiefs in the Syria Ephraimite War. Therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise up over the channels and go over its banks. Essentially, the Assyrians are coming for you. And it will sweep into Judah, it will overflow and pass through, and it will even reach even to the neck, and spread its rings and fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Now, in verse 8, it's telling us here that Emmanuel is not left the picture yet, just because Mahar-Shalal-Hash-Baz is basically being shown as the sign here. So then that's sort of the context of all of this, is that, Israel didn't have faith in the promise, but the promise is still there. It's still in the wings. It's waiting. So then we get down to, let's just say, verse 17. And I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will look eagerly for him. So there's an anticipation here. There's an anticipation and an expectation that Jacob will, come back. That there will be sort of a repentance, a turnaround. Then verse 18. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Sinai. I'll just go a little farther here. It talks about some unfaithfulness. But then it's going to get into, say, verse 9. Chapter 9. After the unfaithfulness, basically you consult mediums, you consult idols, things you shouldn't be doing. But verse 9:1 is a continuation of this. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish in earlier times. He treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt, but later on he shall make it glorious by way of the sea on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Then we sort of go on here to sort of the great passage. Verse 6, for the child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So, all of that is to say that Isaiah 8:18 is there to show that those who are Christ's, because again, this is a messianic passage. Isaiah 7-9 is messianic. It speaks to Christ. It's not midrash. And when it's being used in Hebrews 2:13, it is being used in a messianic capacity. So it's not midrash. It's amphibole. In the local sense, Isaiah 7-9 is talking about the Syro-Ephraimite war. In the bigger sense, in the double meaning, it's talking about the coming of Messiah. So that doesn't make it midrash. That makes it an absolute proper exegesis of Isaiah 8:18. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Again, a lengthy explanation, but we had to really sort of parse this passage out to sort of really get to the nub of it. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. The next super chat here is from Andrew Guler for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Was Zoroastrianism ever a serious competitor to Judaism? No. Any evidence that Jews apostatized to Zoroastrianism? Yes. Here's what's going on. When the Persians take over from the Babylonians, their state religion is Zoroastrianism, and it's a form of dualism. Now, some Jews do convert to Zoroastrianism. They follow the state religion. You find this in every culture. When new potentates take over and they have their state religion, yeah, you're going to get people from converting. It's a state religion. You do what the government does. So, yeah, some Jews apostatized and became Zoroastrianism. But Zoroastrianism was also an ethnic religion, just like Judaism was, just like Israelite religion was. But it was an ethnic religion of the Persians. So it never really was a serious competitor to anyone's faith outside the Persian Empire. And when the Persian Empire collapsed, basically Zoroastrianism sort of went with it. Yeah, it still had a following in Iraq, and Iran until, say, roughly the 7th century AD. But, it got wiped out, essentially wiped out by Islam. Islam basically did a real number on Zoroastrian. There's some interesting Zoroastrian temples that are still standing. And what the Muslims did was they actually bricked up the entrance to these temples. These temples would be really interesting to go and explore someday, because in some ways they're perfectly preserved. Because they've been bricked up from the outside. You can't get in them. These temples are like 50 meters tall, but you can't get in because they bricked up all the entrances. And they've been bricked up since the 7th century. So it'd be fascinating to do an archaeological dig of some of these temples. I mean, they're not buried; they're out in the open, but you can't get at them because of, say, religious tensions. Even though Zoroastrianism is, for all intents and purposes, now extinct. So, overall, Zoroastrianism was really not a serious competitor to Judaism. It appealed to its own ethnicity, just like Judaism appealed to its own ethnicity. These are ethnic religions, and ethnic religions tend to not get a lot of play outside of their particular ethnicities. So, there's just not going to be much there in the way of cross-fertilization. Yet, you are going to get converts, both ways. You can get converts both ways. You do get Jews that become Zoroastrians, and you're going to get some Zoroastrianisms that become Jews too. That's just the inevitable sort of way religions work. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And it's an interesting question, but it's one of those sort of things that, yes, no. Okay, our next super chat is also from Andrew Guller for $10. Thank you so much for that super chat. What was the purpose behind writing of the Talmud? Okay. The purpose of writing of the Talmud was to preserve oral tradition. This comes directly out of Roman occupation of Jerusalem. Comes directly out of this. During 70 AD, the Christians scat. They hightail it out of town. And so the Christians are, they see the Romans coming, and they hightail it. They hightail it. So with the Romans, occupation and siege of Jerusalem, it's a pretty messy deal. Well, then you get the Bar Kokhba revolt. And at the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans have had it. They've absolutely had it with the Jews. They destroyed the temple once. Now we're going to boot them out of Jerusalem entirely. So what ends up happening is, in the 2nd century AD, the Jewish sages start writing down their oral traditions. They know that their community is threatened. At first, it's just, say, the temple rituals that are threatened. Okay, how do we reconcile our temple rituals to living as Jews in a Roman world? But then it expands beyond that to, well, what are other teachings that are going on that need to be preserved? And it continues on to, well, okay, what's the oral law? What are the oral teachings? But also, what are some of the stories and myths? So you get the Talmud coming out of these diaspora Jewish communities who are trying to preserve what has been passed down orally. Of course, some of this is accurate, some of this isn't. So they're throwing in the kitchen sink here for Talmud, and they know it. They already realize that they have contradictory stories in the Talmud. So they get this. Their goal here is not to be consistent, but to be comprehensive. Record everything that could be at all relevant to the history and teaching of Judaism. So that's really sort of the purpose behind the writing of the Talmud. It's to capture all of that oral information. Okay. Oral information. This will, mileage will vary here. Some of it's good. A lot of it's really, really rubbish. It's going to depend. I don't think it's a terribly good guide for history. I think, frankly, if you're using the Talmud for historical work, it's terrible. It's, though, a very, very good insight into, say, the thinking of, say, Second Temple Judaism. I think he'll give you some tremendous insights there. But I also don't think you should use it as a historical guide. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Our next super chat is again from Andrew Guler for $10. Thank you again for that super chat. Really, really appreciate it. You mentioned your martial arts background in the past. Yes, I did. What styles did you study? I dabbled in Krav Maga and kickboxing, only bag work. Okay. Great question. Personal question, but great question. I have studied several styles. Okay. There's some I dabbled in. I dabbled in Shotokan karate. I dabbled in Kendo. I didn't get deep into either one of those. I did get pretty deep into Jiu-Jitsu. Danzen Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, which is a classical style. Cobra Kai never dies. I had the real fortunate opportunity to study under some of the best Jiu-Jitsu teachers in California. Okay? It was really funny, actually. I could tell you the story. I was actually working at a data center and wanted to get back into martial arts again. And I had done a little bit of jiu-jitsu before this. But I got this brochure. And, it talked about, a 10th Dan jiu-jitsu guy and his student's 7th Dan. And I'm thinking, yeah, sure, right. Likely story. Because, 10th Dan, that's really high, It's like, yeah, sure, likely. Very likely. But I knew enough about martial arts, that I could spot the real deal in an instant. And, so anyway, I never do martial arts without actually checking out the dojo first. I want to see what I'm getting into. And, the teachers' names were, Siegfried Kufroth and Tony Janovich. And, I stopped in and I met them and, how are you doing? Yeah, I'm doing fine. Just want to check you out. And, I sat in there, I'm not a buff guy. Okay. I'm really kind of, I look very out of shape. I'm not half as out of shape as I look. Okay, but I look out of shape. And I watched these guys practice. And I could see it's the real deal. So this is the real deal. These guys are getting thrown to the floor, and you can tell that sometimes they're hurting. Okay, so I thought, okay, this is the real McCoy. I've seen a lot of fakes. I've seen a lot of phonies. Lose the energy. No, none of that BS. It's like this is real technique, real classical jiu-jitsu, and that's what I was looking for. Okay. I ended up studying at that school for 8 years. It was marvelous. I really enjoyed it. I really wish I could have continued my training there. It was that good. It was really good. I would highly recommend Tony Janovich as a teacher. Really an excellent jiu-jitsu teacher. And he's highly respected in the Danzan Ryu community. I mean, there's probably no one that was more respected in the Danzan Ryu community than he was. So, yeah, I had the great privilege to study under a fantastic teacher. So I did a lot of Danzan Ryu Jiu-Jitsu. Later on, I when I went to graduate school and I couldn't actually do it anymore because I couldn't afford it, I did some Tai Chi. I did a year of Tai Chi, and I did a combat style of Tai Chi, and really enjoyed that too. And I still practice the Tai Chi, and I find it very interesting, very how do I say it? It's not meditation, but it is very much movement, and so it sort of keeps my my muscle memory of what I did for jiu-jitsu alive, so I don't forget what I did in jiu-jitsu. So I do a Chen style Tai Chi, which is very it's got punches, kicks. It doesn't. It's not your hairy fairy Tai Chi. It's combat style Tai Chi. Okay, it's sort of kung fu light. to put a kind of it into context. So, yeah, it was something. It was well worth doing, and I really enjoyed doing it. I even did some sword work with Tai Chi. So, yeah. So there's my martial arts history. Very much enjoyed all of it. I found it fascinating, found it interesting. I learned a lot. I still carry those lessons with me today. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, next super chat is from Billy Ningen for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good evening, Dr. Falk. Do we have any evidence of Semitic migration to the Americas? No. Not until... I would say not until the 17th century AD. Okay? That's probably the earliest we find of Semitic migration to the Americas. Basically, when they come over with some Europeans. He goes, I think a heavy objection to Christianity is that God didn't know or didn't care about the Americas. Thoughts? Well, I don't think that's a valid objection. Okay? Basically, the core of Christianity is that Christ died for first Israel and then the Gentiles. That includes everybody in the world. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Okay? It's not that God didn't know about the Americas. Just like saying well, God didn't know about Ireland. It's like, no, God knew about Ireland. Okay? It's just part of the plan of salvation history. That it starts with Israel. And then the rest of the world is redeemed incrementally. So I think that I don't think it's a valid objection, honestly. So I would take, for example, exception here, like for example, the idea that uh like sometimes what Mormons say. Well, Israel came to America and started that became the Native American population. Well, there's no evidence for any of that. That's complete hogwash. Complete hogwash. Uh, no anthropologist will buy that. There's no evidence for it. Many of the animals that you find, for example, in the Book of Mormon, are not found in the in prehistoric Americas, pre say colonization America. It just total hogwash. Total hogwash. But but just because there wasn't a Semitic migration does not mean that God didn't know or that America was not in the plan of salvation either. It's clear from the scriptures that the world is in the plan of salvation. And as far as I last checked, America is part of the world. So because God so loved the world, he also loved America as well. So I think that is the appropriate view here of salvation history. We don't need a Semitic migration to America to make this work. It's just part of the plan. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. And I hope that answers your question. Okay, now we're on to the Twidget. Still got that one selected. Super chat. Here's the next super chat here from Billy Ningen for $10 again. Thank you very much for the super chat. It has been well attested that Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria already developed their own philosophy and science before the Greeks. Indeed, it did. Did ancient Israel contribute anything to these fields? Not really. It's hard to say what they did contribute. Now, we are told that, say, Solomon wrote many books. He wrote many books. He wrote on plants and animals. So he was a kind of natural philosopher, if we want to use that term. So there was, in a sense, some learning that was going on in ancient Israel. But we don't have a lot of that preserved, all honesty. We do have wisdom literature. And insofar as wisdom literature means practical living, yeah, we got lots of that. But science and philosophy, in, say, the purest sense, not so much. We don't have as much of that. It just doesn't seem to have been a particular interest of, say, the Israelites. Sciences, not so much. I mean, we do know that they did some, because we have records that they had written books on some of these. So we do know that they had some, say, interest in the natural sciences. Philosophy, we don't have much on that. It does seem that because ancient Israel was a theocratic state, its interest was much more in, say, religious things, more than it was in, say, philosophical principles. So I've got some. Yeah, I don't think they this is just not their area. And frankly, not every culture has everything, wrapped up either. For example, the Greeks were tremendously gifted in the area of philosophy. When it comes to religious thought, they kind of suck. So, not every culture is going to have everything wrapped up. That's fair. That's totally valid. Every culture has its strengths and weaknesses. And just because Israel didn't, really go full bore into philosophy and science doesn't make their contribution any less. They gave the world the Abrahamic religions. That's a huge contribution. That's changed so much, it isn't even funny. They didn't need philosophy or science to change the world. They changed it through religion. That is very, very interesting, considering that, say for the next 3 centuries after Christ, you had barbarians knocking down on the war, rampaging across Europe, Okay. They brought a civilizing element to the West. Really, they did. So, they have their own particular way of dealing with things and their own perspectives, and I think that needs to be really, emphasized. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it, and I hope that answered your question. Okay. Our next one here is from Billy Ningen for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Dr. Falk, what is your thought on Moses being identified with Ursu and the theory that the Exodus took place in 1186 under Seknach? Thanks. I think it's rubbish. I think it's total rubbish. This is the late Exodus theory. Basically the 12th century Exodus theory. It's espoused by guys like Gary Rensburg. I think this is complete bonkers. It's bonkers. They have to reinterpret so much it isn't even funny. I'll give you 2 reasons right off the top. Okay, I'll give you 3 reasons why I think this is bonkers. Okay? First reason I think this is bonkers is because it has to reinterpret the Merneptah Stela. And the Merneptah Stela dates to roughly 1217 BC, where it talks about Israel being in Canaan. They have to interpret the Merneptah Stela to say that, the poetic stela of the Merneptah Stela has Israel still inside of Egypt. So when they say Israel seeds no more, they're quelling a domestic population. Wow, that's just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. You look at all the poetical stelas, poetical sections of basically Egyptian documents. It's all outward focused. All of this relates to what's happening outside of Egypt, how Egypt is relating to its neighbors. It's not talking about quelling domestic uprisings. That's an embarrassment. That's not something you put in a poetic section. So that's reason number 1, I think it's bonkers. The second reason I think it's bonkers is because it flies in the face of everything we know about the conquest. You got Hatzor being destroyed in say roughly 2010 BC. Well, if this is the only viable candidate for Hatzor to be destroyed by Joshua. And yet it's happening 40 years prior to the Exodus? What? And you can correlate that to Garstang's late Bronze Age destruction of the Middle Building. Same deal. Mount Ebal is also, that's a late Bronze to be early Iron Age 1, altar site. Again, that's going to be before this so-called Exodus. Then you also have the fact that Avaris was abandoned in mid-Dynasty 19, not Dynasty 20. You have no Semitic site inside of Egypt that's a viable candidate for the Exodus. You know, if you don't have a Semitic population living in Egypt, you don't have an Exodus. And there's no viable candidate for a population living in Egypt, in the Delta region, that is consistent with this particular view of the Exodus. It's completely bonkers. It's completely bonkers. And, you know, you just go around in circles with these people who espouse this. They're just so disconnected with the data, it isn't even funny. Some of this is that they were trained by others who had espoused this view and overwhelming loyalty to that, but, you know, reason has left the door on this one. You know, it put on its shoes and started running away on a marathon, and reason's not coming back anytime soon. So, that's my thoughts on this. How do I really feel about this? Yeah, that tells you how I really feel about this. Yeah, I don't think this is viable in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, I know they're trying to time this with the Bronze Age collapse, but the Bronze Age collapse is a long enough period of time that you don't need to time it right to this point. It's silly. It's really, really silly. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, the next super chat is from Mouthwash for $5. Good to see you here tonight. Hope you're doing well. And he says, I think he means in Hellenistic times. Okay, hell times. Well, Freud could get hot. Celts were in Ptolemaic Egypt as bodyguards, mercs, not earlier. But apparently King Tut was mostly European? Was this like Mamluk slavery? Okay. Tut was not mostly European. Now, you gotta take these sort of DNA tests with the proverbial grain of salt. Okay. King Tut was from the Theban line of princes. Okay. Now, some of his ancestors could have had Semitic parentage. It's possible. There is some suggestion that his grandparents were Semitic. Okay, at least one side of it was. But that's a long distance from him being European. We also have to understand, too, that Celts, we don't have... Celts are... You get Celts that go from Galatia all the way up to, say, the French coast. In the truest sense. Okay? So, in Ptolemaic times, especially under Roman Egypt, in Roman Egypt, you're going to get people moving all around the Roman Empire. Okay? Because that's what the Roman Empire allowed. Because Roman Empire made roads everywhere, they allowed free travel between the various provinces. So you did get people from Galatia traveling to Egypt and vice versa. Okay? Prior to that, in Ptolemaic Egypt, not so much. You might have had some people from, say, Greece, maybe come in through that vector. Say from Galatia to Greece to then Egypt. Through, say, Alexandria and Necrotis. Okay. So, but we don't find it much earlier than that. But definitely King Tut has no European roots. We don't find Europeans. And I'll put that also into perspective too. We do find Hittites. Now, are Hittites European? That's a maybe. That's a maybe. We do find, say, for example, some Hittites entering Egypt during, say, the Second Intermediate Period. There are some Hittites that enter into, and they're from Turkey. So Turkey is kind of one of those sort of borderline cases. Okay, they're borderline. They're Indo-European. They're Indo-European. They're not quite European, though. So again, this is one of the reasons why we have to take, for example, say the results of, say, genetic companies with the proverbial grain of salt, especially when we're talking about, say, ancient history, because they're using genetic lines, and genetic lines can move through a population as the population itself moves. Like, for example, you're going to find European genes in India, a lot of them. And that's because a lot of European genes come from India. But as they're spread, as those people groups spread from, say, India to Iraq, to Turkey and the Caucasus, and then into Europe, those genes are going to move with them. Okay? So, just because we have a population today in Europe that has Indo-European genes, and that some of those genes end up in Egypt, does not mean that Egypt had European visitors. They could have originated from somewhere else. And that's what's so tricky about these genetic profiles, is it's a synchronic view. It's a synchronic view. It's taking every genetic distribution and basically saying our modern distribution of today is how it was in the past. And that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works. The past had a very different genetic distribution than what we have today. It's the same genes. It's just distributed in a different way. So, with that said, it's likely that there were some people that had Indo-European genes who were part of, say, King Tut's family tree, but that doesn't make them European. And that's the takeaway here. There was no Europeans that came to Egypt. But some Hittites did. And as I said, that's that borderline case of people in Anatolia being on the border between Asia and Europe. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Our next super chat here is from Sean Horton for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And he says, is it just me, or do evangelicals absolutely fail at symbolism? Well, I'm not going to rag on evangelicals too badly, but sometimes, yeah. And if so, what are the historical reasons for that? Oh, that one's easy. I'll get to that in a moment. And I ask as an evangelical, so by all means, stand on your soapbox if you've got one on the subject. Okay. It comes down to the modernist fundamentalist debate of the 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, fundamentalist didn't mean what it means today. Let's be clear about that. The modernist fundamentalist debate does not mean the same thing it would today. Modernist was just another word for, say, theological liberal. A fundamentalist in the 1930s means the same thing as evangelical. It won't be until, say, the 1950s when you get the split between evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And fundamentalism carries on the name even though they become something different. Evangelicals are more like the fundamentalists of the 1930s. Okay, so, with that context in mind, you had this going on in the 1930s where modernists, theological liberals, were taking over schools, taking over churches, basically turning their back on, say, the historic Christian faith. They were basically glorified atheists, essentially. Right? They were basically agnostics, atheists. Some of them were spiritualists. I mean, some of them were really out there. We want to get right down to it. Wasn't pretty. So what happened was many of the great schools that were teaching, seminaries, basically became schools of theological liberalism. They were turning out students and pastors that had a ruined faith, and that they were ruining congregations as a result. So you had this stand go on. Guys like Ockengay and Henry. These were people that were basically saying, hey, there are fundamentals of the faith that we're going to stand behind. The 6 essential doctrines of Christianity. Belief in the resurrection, belief in the Trinity, belief in the virgin birth. These sort of fundamentals of the Christian faith, salvation by grace through faith. These are the essentials. And they call these the fundamentals. Well, part of that reaction to the modernists was the whole idea of how do we read Scripture, that hermeneutic. And many people basically took the step that, well, we don't even dare risk allegorizing the text because that could lead to a theologically bad place. So there was this emphasis upon, I would not say a historical grammatical method, but more of a literal reading of the text. And here what I mean is a naive literalism. This is why you have so many say, seminaries and churches today on the fundamentalist bent that, subscribe to things such as a literal reading of the book of Revelation. Like, for example, Moody Bible Institute basically requires all their staff and students to subscribe to a literal reading of the book of Revelation. And they did that as a bulwark against modernism. This is also why you find its counterpart in the Old Testament as 1 Kings 6:1. That literal reading of the 480 years was used as a shibboleth test. Basically, if you read 1 Kings 6:1 literally, you will read the rest of the Old Testament literally. Even when it uses symbolism and figurative language. Oh boy. Yeah. Yeah, we don't even want to talk about Psalm 91:4. Okay. Basically, what'll happen is if you do bring up these figurative verses like Psalm 91:4 or Jesus talking about "I am the door," it'll get to a sort of a post hoc kind of, oh, except that. We should reread everything literally, except that, and except that, and except that, and that's sort of the hermeneutic, really. So this is why evangelicals are not so good at symbolism. It's historical. It really is historical. There's no reason why they can't be. I mean, honestly, there's no reason why evangelicals can't be good. And there are actually some evangelical scholars that are excellent at the symbolism. You know, and but again, it falls back on the historical reason of the modernist fundamentalist debate that this is sort of say the side effects of all that. So the remedy of this is responsible scholarship, really. We have to be responsible in our interpretations. We have to be responsible in our use of symbolism. We do have to be. This is one of the reasons, too, that I'm very, very cautious about the allegorical method. I really don't like the allegorical method because it can get into some dangerous theological territory, and I know my church history well enough to know that. So I do use symbolism. I do use figurative language. I do think that we should read the Bible contextually. I'm a very strong believer in the historical grammatical method. But I also understand, too, that if you lean too much into allegory, it can lead you into dark, dark places. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay, another one from Sean Horton for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Are there any ideas why Genesis 32 Esau just so happened to be headed in Jacob's direction as Jacob was returning? If you plot my verse references by time, you get a rough idea when I start asking about Exodus. You know what he means by that? Are there any ideas why he's in the super chat? If you plot my verse references by time, you can get a rough idea when I'll start asking about Exodus. Okay, are you leading up to an Exodus question here? Is that what you're getting at? I'm not quite sure. But anyway, let's take your question. Any ideas why Genesis 32 Esau just so happened to be headed in Jacob's direction as Jacob was returning? I'm not quite sure. Oh, he says, sorry, my verse references for the last month or two have all been about Genesis, going through commentary. Okay, all right, I get it now. There's a theme. Okay, you have a theme going here. I'm going to take a quick look at Genesis 32. I don't think it gives a reason. Other than Jacob had been spotted. Let's pull this up, actually. Genesis 32, verse 1. Now, as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. And Jacob said when he saw them, this is God's camp. So he named the place Mahanaim. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir in the country of Edom. He also commanded them, saying, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. And I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and males and female servants, and have sent them to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore he is coming to meet you. 400 men are with him. Ooh, okay. Again, we're not told Esau's intent here. But 400 men. Now, you have to realize that when Abraham clobbered the Mesopotamian coalition, he had 300, and I think it's 312. Esau's coming with 100 more men. Okay. This doesn't look good. He's afraid. He's afraid. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Verse 7. And he divided the people who were with him, and flocks and herds and camels into two companies. Okay. Now there's a reason why Jacob is doing this. This is the reason why. If one, he's basically dividing his family in half. Okay? He's dividing his family in half. If one gets slaughtered, the other one has a chance to get away. So that's what's going on. As far as seeing which half of his family can run faster, yeah. So depending on how Esau approaches, basically he's doubling his chances of survival. Verse 8. For he said, if Esau comes to one company and attacks it, then the company which is left will escape. Okay, so that's exactly what we just said. So that's exactly Jacob's plan here, is to divide the company into two. If one gets attacked, the other one has a chance to get away. He's doubling his chances of his family surviving. Verse 9. And Jacob said, O God, of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who did say to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. All right. I will just go right down to 11. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me, the mothers with the children. So he selects some things to offer Esau, gifts, etc. Okay, then we get this excursus here. Now, this is actually part of the story where he prays to God, then he wrestles with God, and God dislocates his thigh. Okay, God kind of cheats. Okay. He is God. He's got the ability. If you're going to take on God in a wrestling match, but it's basically to prove to Jacob who's in control, who's in charge. So we have to take that into account here in the narrative as well. That, okay, yes, he's praying to God. He's preserving his family. But God's going to show to Jacob, yeah, I'm still God. I'm still in charge here. Yes, you ask for blessing. Yes, okay, I'll give it to you. But, you're going to... You've got to realize that this is not a casual thing. You're not going to be able to trick your way out of this. So this is actually really part of the entire narrative here, and I don't think we should separate this from the narrative. However, the narrative does pick up again in Genesis 33, when Jacob sees Esau coming. And Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. They put the maids and the children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. No favoritism here. Yeah. Ooh, How would you like to be his children here? Yeah, the children of the maids, you get to meet Esau first. Rachel and Joseph, we're putting in the very rack. Nice dad. Dad of the year. Dad and father of the year.
Introduce his brother.
This is dad of the year here material. Hey, nobody said these people were nice. Okay? Verse 3, but he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Okay, so Jacob still is going ahead of his family. Okay? He's not hiding behind his children. But he is selecting which ones are his favorite. He is playing favorites here. I'm sure this is not something that was missed by the other children or their mothers. Yeah. Verse 4, then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children and said, who are these with you? So he said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the maids came near with their children, and they bowed down. And Leah likewise with her children, they bowed down. And afterwards Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. And he said, what do you mean by all this company which I have met? He said, to find favor in the sight of my Lord? Esau said, I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own. Okay, so the intention of Esau is union, connection. He's trying to reconnect with his brother. He's done well. Esau did well in Edom. He's found family. He's got an army. He's got success and power. He's got it all. He knows he has it all. So, at this point, this seems to be the intention of Esau. He's not out there to kill him. Now, I think he's brought the 400 men to impress. Okay? And then just in case Jacob still is acting like an idiot. Because he hasn't seen his brother in a long time. I'm sure the 400 men there were not just window dressing. If Jacob did anything stupid. So, this is the ancient Near East. You can't always trust blood ties. Okay? And finally, verse 12. Esau said, let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you. So, that seems to be... but he said to him, I'm going to continue just a little. My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven one hard day, the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass before the servant, and I will proceed at my leisure according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir. And Esau said, please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, what need is there here? Yeah. What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of the Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. So that seems to be the intention of Esau, is to reconnect with his brother. Maybe a bit of showing off too. Show how successful he's been. Kind of like a high school reunion. Hey, haven't seen you in 40 years. Look at my Lamborghini.
A little more of that.
Okay, but it doesn't seem like, at least from the text, that Esau is out for blood. So that seems to be what's going on here. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Let's see how we're doing here. We've been going here for 2 hours. Far. So we got our next super chat here from the Camilla Pard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Shabbat Shalom. Well, Shabbat Shalom to you too. A friend of mine would like to know if getting buzzed is sinful. Buzzed. Don't. Well, I think you mean the imbibing of Mary Jane. Well, how do I say this without getting hit by community standards? Very carefully. That's how we do this. It's going to depend on a lot of things, honestly. Okay. First of all, for recreational use. Okay. What he says? No, no, no. That's not what we mean. Okay, what do you mean then? You care? Oh, from alcohol. Okay, that's different. Okay, that's not buzzed. Okay, from where we're from. Okay, you have to understand. We live in Vancouver here. It smells like skunk here frequently. So and it's legal here. So we get that question a little more than about alcohol. Okay. Um, no, I did not. I have to admit, I did not know that he meant alcohol. I thought he meant the other kind of recreational pharmaceuticals. Okay. Alcohol's a lot easier to answer, honestly. Uh, Intoxication from alcohol is not inherently sinful. Yeah, I know this is going to put a lot of say fundamentalists on a complete tirade. It's not inherently sinful. Some of it, again, is going to depend upon circumstances. Now, there is a couple times, circumstances where it is prohibited. If you happen to be the high priest, if you're a king, or a ruler, or a man with lots of responsibility, you should not be constantly intoxicated. Okay? This basically one of the things in, for example, in the Old Testament, kings and the high priests were forbidden to get, sloshed. However, when we read, say, passages in the Old Testament, there is seemed to be, like, for example, we have in the book of Ruth, where Boaz is in the granary. He's in the granary after the day's harvest, and he cooks himself some grain, and basically pours himself wine. And it says in the text, his heart was warm. This is an Israelite euphemism for over the legal drinking limit. Okay? He was drunk. And Ruth approaches him when he's drunk and proposes a marriage contract. And he goes, yeah, sounds good to me. I'm in my 50s, you're in your 30s. Sure, good. Sounds like a good business transaction to me. Okay? But Boaz was intoxicated. He was drunk. Like, for example, take another example. At the wedding at Canaan, where Jesus changes the water into wine. And the wine steward says, well, who serves the good wine after everyone's drunk? The idea here is that everyone is so intoxicated that they can't tell the good wine from the bad wine anymore, so you serve the bad wine at the end. You start with the good wine because everyone still has their faculties and their taste buds in place. Okay? So the idea here is that everyone is getting schnockered at the wedding in Canaan. This is part of these wedding festivities, is that people were getting drunk. And frankly, we're going to be honest about this. Okay, we've got to be very honest about this. If this is a good wine, okay, now we have to understand what we mean by good wine here. This is the high octane stuff. Jesus didn't make, let's just say, weak wine. He wasn't making grape juice. He made the high octane stuff. We also have, for example, in, say, the Levitical law, in the Torah law, where, let's say you were, say, a long distance away. You were a long, long distance away from being able to go to the tabernacle to give your offerings, your tithes. The law states that you could take your tithes, exchange it for money, and then spend that money as your heart desires, including food and strong drink. Now, strong drink is very strong wine. And we do know that Israel had the capacity to produce strong wine. Now, strong wine is not your it's not your average alcohol. It's up to 18% ABV. Okay? There were ways, and we do know that ancient peoples did do this, that you could take a alcoholic beverage, spike it a little with a little extra sugar, and you could get that ABV up to 18%. That's pretty strong. And this is what people in the past used to get drunk on. You go to ancient Egypt, people didn't get drunk on beer. Beer was just has such a low alcohol by volume content that it was really just, it was between roughly 2 and 5%. It averaged around 3. So beer was not something that you got buzzed on or drunk. But the wine you could get really drunk on. And that's what, say, for example, the Ptolemies were accused of being drunkards, because they just had their own private vineyards and they would get drunk on wine. But with that said, too, there is wine and alcohol is not inherently sinful. If it was, well, God would not then select it as a offering. We have to remember, one of the libation offerings of the temple and the tabernacle was wine offerings. You're not going to give something inherently sinful as an offering to the Lord. The Lord only wants good stuff. He only wants good stuff. You're supposed to bring your grain and your new wine. That's part of your tithe. Well, the Lord drinking your wine because he wants you not to be sinful is not quite the point here. Give it all to the temple. You know, the priest will take care of it. Don't worry about it. We wouldn't want you to be sinful.
Second temple. Yeah.
Now, there were some offerings that were outlawed you couldn't bring to the temple. I mean, there's the obvious pork. That's not permitted. This is unclean. But there's some offerings that were clean that were still prohibited, like honey. Honey was not allowed as a temple offering. But wine definitely was. So absolutely, it's not inherently sinful. It's not, you don't want to be a drunkard, perpetually drunk. That's, then you're not living your life. You're not practicing, say, the spirit of Christianity. You've got bigger problems at that point. Okay? So I'm not saying here that it's good to be, say, perpetually drunk. Am I saying that being drunk is a sin? No. It's equally not a sin. But if it becomes a habit, if it becomes a problem in your personal life, if it becomes a problem in your devotional life, well, it also depends on what kind of drunk you are as well. Yeah, that's my producer here raises a good point too. It also depends upon what your behavior is when you're drunk. That also is a huge factor. Are you getting behind the wheel of a car and putting people in danger? Yeah, then it's a sin. That's a sin. Are you violent when you're drunk? Then, yes, stay away from it. Then it's sinful for you. But then at that point, it's not the intoxication that's making you sinful. It's the violent behavior that comes out as a result of that makes you sinful. Do you make bad decisions when you're intoxicated? That could also be a problem. Do you cheat on your wife when you're drunk? Yeah, then it's a sin. It's a sin that's additive, but it's still sinful at that point. But if you're doing it in the privacy of your home, you're not hurting anyone, no one is being harmed, it's not inherently sinful. It's just not. And the Bible doesn't support that it is. So, I hope that explains it. I'm glad you clarified the question, because that says this is actually a lot easier question to answer than what I thought we were talking about. Okay. So, the occasional intoxication is not sinful. But again, depends on circumstances. A lot of it depends on circumstances. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And I hope that clarifies the issue for you. Thank you so very much. I'm not even through the super chats. Oh. Oh, okay, I'll take that then. We'll take this non-super chat early then. I don't want to miss that. Cal Yeast asked, I always thought drunkenness was a matter of overindulgence and gluttony. Am I inaccurate? Yes, you are actually. Because gluttony is something else. Now, to understand gluttony, you have to understand knife-edge agriculture and food security. What we're talking about when we talk about gluttony is not overindulgence. It's murder. It's murder. We have to remember, in ancient Israel, and really a lot of the ancient Near East, food was rationed. Okay? Food was rationed. when the division of the land happened in ancient Israel, it wasn't by accident. Every tribe got a portion of land, and every clan got a portion within that. And every clan had to ration its grain, its food. Okay? If you overate, you overindulged, you were eating somebody else's ration. In knife-edge agriculture, you ate somebody else's grain, that other person died. They starved. It was akin to murder. We don't understand gluttony in our culture. We don't understand gluttony in our culture because we have an overabundance of food. That brings its own problems. Okay? That has its own problems. Gluttony is not necessarily a problem in our culture because it's not actually, doesn't have the same consequences. It's not the core issue that the Old Testament is driving at when it talks about gluttony. Gluttony means you're really killing someone else. So, this is not a matter of just indulging the flesh. You know, the fact is, we do eat for pleasure. Everybody ate for pleasure. Even back then, people ate for pleasure. That's not a problem. Feast days. People ate excessively at feast days because that was a pleasurable thing to do. Okay? Gluttony meant you consistently ate somebody else's food ration. A food ration you're not entitled to. That has its own problems and its own issues. But it doesn't have anything to do with drunkenness. Drunkenness is a completely different issue because of the other societal effects that it has. So we want to make that clear, that the two issues of drunkenness and gluttony are not related. They're different issues with different effects, different outcomes. So I hope that clarified the issue, and thank you very much for the question. All right, let's get back to the super chats. Here. Okay, I think we're here at the Camilla part again for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is the difference between monolatry, henotheism, and monarchic monotheism? Okay. Let's start with monolatry. Monolatry means you only serve one god. Okay? Basically, mono, one, latry, worship. Latris. Okay? So you're only worshiping one god. That's monolatry. You can have monolatrous monotheism. You can have monolatrous henotheism. You can have monolatrous polytheism. You can have monolatrous pantheism. Okay? So, monolatry is just a descriptor that says the way you practice your worship. Henotheism is the idea that there are many equal gods running around, but you only worship one of them. So that's henotheism. So you got lots of gods running around. It's kind of like polytheism, except you are loyal to only one of them. So the metaphysics of divinity for henotheism and polytheism are practically the same. Many equally powerful gods. Okay? Monarchic monotheism is you've got one big god, one powerful, all-powerful god. And beneath him are minor, lesser powers, lesser gods, lesser spirits, angels, demons, whatever. Okay? So only one God in monarchic monotheism is truly God proper. All the little gods running around in monarchic monotheism are not really God, but they're more powerful than you. And they'll make a mess of your day if you cross them. So think of it this way.
Lesser gods, but
Yeah, they're lesser gods, but you're not one of them.
not.
So think of it like this. A monarchic monotheism is basically that there's a variety of beings between you and God. It's not just the big God alone, but there's a whole sort of ecosystem between you and him. Whereas henotheism, they're all the same as far as their abilities, at least in potential. Now, in a henotheistic system, one god may stand out as eventually more powerful, but they're not inherently so. So that's the essential difference between, say, monolatry, henotheism, and monarchic monotheism. I hope that answers the question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay, Johnny C for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did Upper Egypt trade with Lower Egypt during the Hyksos period? That's an interesting question. Since Egypt was an agricultural society, would the 7-year famine affect Upper Egypt, or would they rely on surplus from the years of plenty during Joseph? Okay. Just prior to the Hyksos, we do have records of, say, the 13th dynasty trading with the 14th dynasty. Now, the 14th dynasty are the sort of the shepherd kings that preceded the Hyksos. And they were essentially warlords that roamed around the Nile Delta. The 13th dynasty, which is the Theban dynasty that was based out of Ichitawi, there was trade between the 14th and, say, the 13th dynasty. Now, when the Hyksos take over, the 13th dynasty skedaddles out of Ichitawi. They go back to Thebes. We know that during the 16th dynasty, 16th and 17th dynasty in Thebes, and the Hyksos 15th dynasty, that there was interaction. They were at war at times, but the 16th and 17th dynasties were also had a vassalage situation going on with the Hyksos. Essentially, the Hyksos extorted tribute from the Thebans. One of the reasons why the Thebans eventually rebel is because they're being heavily taxed for tribute. So there does seem to be a situation going on where there's heavy taxation happening. So when the famine does hit Egypt, and that would be probably because of a low Nile conditions, it would have affected Upper Egypt, because that's usually the cause of a famine in Egypt. You get low Nile. Low Nile levels mean that there's a lack of crops, people starve. Again, that knife edge agriculture kicks in. And Upper Egypt would have definitely been affected by this. There's no question they would have been affected by this. Anytime you have famine in Egypt, yeah, both Upper and Lower Egypt are affected. So there would have probably been some need for the Thebans to have purchased grain from the Hyksos during those years of famine. So they would have had to, in some respect, rely on that surplus from Joseph. Now, to what extent was that reliance happening is unknown. Were they forced to sell their land, like the ones in, say, the lower delta? We do know that large portions going almost all the way up, at least to Thebes, had been sold to the Hyksos. Because one of the things that Ahmose the First promises his soldiers is a parcel of land in exchange for service, because all the land had been controlled by the Hyksos. So we do have some pretty good evidence here that there was a flow of goods coming from at least Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, and probably vice versa as well. Trade, maybe not so much. Extortion, oh yeah, definitely there was extortion. So that's about all we know of the period. Can we say it's definitely from the surplus of Joseph? Probably not, but it's a pretty good guess, because we do know that all that land had been taken over by the Hyksos. So, anyway, that's probably the best we can answer this right now with the data that we have. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Charlie Don't Surf 334 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. What is your view of the Apocrypha Deuterocanonicals? Are they inspired scripture or not, and why? Okay. Here's my opinion on the Apocrypha. It's not scripture. Okay, I'm going to lay that right out there. I don't think the Apocrypha are scripture. Do I think the Apocrypha are interesting reading? Oh, yeah. Do I think you can learn something from the Apocrypha? Sure. Absolutely. Why don't I think the Apocrypha are inspired scripture? For one thing, it's not recognized as part of the Jewish canon. Okay? So it's something that is that comes along beside the Jewish canon, but it's never been recognized as Jewish canon. So it's not traditionally part of the Old Testament. Second of all, a lot of the Apocrypha have authorship or consistency issues that disqualify them from being considered inspired scripture. We do see this in some other places, even in, for example, potential candidates for New Testament documents, like First Clement, where they disqualify themselves as being scripture. Now, that's not to say there isn't value, either literary or historical value, in the Apocrypha. It is to say they are not inspired. Okay? And I have no reason at this point to believe they're not that they are inspired. Now, I know there are going to be Catholic apologists out there that vehemently disagree with me on this. Yeah, fair enough. Go for it. But it doesn't have the same force of church tradition. It doesn't have the force of, and here I'm talking about like the Church Universal, not just the Roman Catholics. Sorry, Roman Catholicism does not get to determine the church tradition for everyone. But even if you have just restricted down to, say, Jewish canonicity, it's not there. This is something that really comes, their recognition as scripture only comes very, very late Christian history. And yeah, it's used. It is used through, I'd say, you start seeing the earliest recognized uses of it in around 500 AD, and then it sort of like goes into it threads into Western Christianity much more than Eastern Christianity. I know there's sometimes it's used in Eastern Christianity too, but it generally isn't. Okay, I'll take that too. Hmm? Okay. Okay, I'm going to take this supplemental question as well. So was the Septuagint never considered Jewish scripture? The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Jewish scripture. Now, the Septuagint does contain much of the Apocrypha. But here's the thing. It has there are various versions of the Septuagint. It's also not necessarily a reflection of canon itself. It's the canon plus. So you do get various items being included in the Septuagint that would not have fallen under, say, the canon of Ezra and Nehemiah. Or at least within that legal framework of Ezra and Nehemiah. So you get, for example, say, the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text does not include the Apocrypha generally. But the Septuagint does. Okay, fair enough. But we also have to consider, too, that, we don't find, say, much of the Apocrypha in, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least being quoted heavily in even Second Temple literature. Now, it is quoted in Second Temple literature. There's no doubt about that. But there's limits to that, and to that framework. Now, there are some Apocrypha that are heavily, heavily relied on and heavily quoted in Second Temple period literature. For example, First Enoch. That's probably the big example here. But First Enoch is not ever considered scripture. It's considered pseudepigrapha, which is another class again. So we have Apocrypha, which are, say, not scripture, and pseudepigrapha, which are things written under a false name. So in the case of pseudepigrapha, we know it's, there's a falseness, right, that's prima facie in its presentation. Apocrypha is a little more borderline. Apocrypha, you have to sort of look into sort of the details and see why it sort of disqualifies itself. I mean, it's not as blatant as pseudepigrapha, to be very, very honest. But, again, Septuagint includes the Apocrypha, at least some versions of it. Not by no means all of it, but some versions of the Septuagint do include the Apocrypha. But those books were still not considered to be Jewish canon. But they did appeal to, say, the wider Greco-Roman audience. And that's a very, very important factor, is that much of the Septuagint was never intended for strictly a Jewish audience. A strictly Jewish audience was probably quite happy with generally, at least the Jewish audience in, say, Judea was generally quite happy with, say, its variants of the texts that were written in Hebrew. Really, the Septuagint was much more, the target audience was basically Greek speakers, Hellenistic speakers. People who needed a Greek translation. So the intent of, say, the translators of the Septuagint was to bring as much of the Jewish writings to a wider Hellenistic audience. So canonicity was really not forefront in the mind of, say, the Septuagint translators. Distribution was. It really was intended to be, again, inclusive. It's the same. It's sort of the same mentality that was put into the Talmud like we were talking about earlier. The purpose of the Talmud was to be comprehensive. Purpose of the Septuagint was to be comprehensive. This is also why we find some texts in Septuagint are longer than we find in, say, in the Masoretic text, is because the point of the Septuagint is to be as exhaustive. This is the unabridged version. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciated. But my opinion, and again, take this with a proverbial grain of salt, I don't think the Apocrypha are scripture. I think they're interesting. I think they can be helpful. I think they can be good source of historical data. I don't think they're scripture. So, anyway, that's my opinion. Right, let's look at the next super chat. Okay. Next super chat is from Angel VW or WVM for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. What are your thoughts on the Euphrates drying up and the Temple Institute in Israel gaining 5 red heifers? Well, I had heard it was a drought season, so I don't play a huge amount of stock in I don't play a huge amount of stock in um, the Euphrates drying up as, say, a sign. But, the rains will come again, and again, then you'll have, the Euphrates being restored. So I don't think it is a issue. But, the Temple Institute in Israel gaining 5 red heifers. I'm going to say this about the Temple Institute. They've been working towards this end for 30 years. 30, 40 years. They've been preparing for, the rebuilding of the third temple forever. They've got a ephod, they've got an altar, they've got a candelabra. I remember back in the 1990s when they had announced that, somebody had bred a red heifer. Was that red heifer any good? Well, it's not going to do them. Could be. Look, a red heifer isn't going to do them any good without a place to actually spread the ashes to do the sacrifice. So what if they've got 5 red heifers? It ain't. Unless you've got a temple, what does it matter? Or a tabernacle. They're not redoing the tabernacle because they can't. As far as Jewish law is now concerned, the only place that's acceptable to do the sacrifice of the red heifer is at the temple of the Lord. Without the temple of the Lord, so what? So what? Now, if they manage to gain, access to the Temple Mount, rebuild an altar, put in a mobile altar up there, burn the red heifer up there, okay, maybe. But, they got to reduce this thing to ashes. You got to remember that it's not just that they have the red heifers. It's not enough. They have to be able to have access to the site. They have to sacrifice it. They have to burn it down to ash. Yeah.
What about
cloning doesn't help. Because the red heifers have to be perfect. It has to be a developmental thing. Israel has always had a line, at least in ancient times, of red heifers. They've always bred for this. But it can't just be any red heifer. It has to be a red heifer with no white hairs. A single white hair will disqualify the red heifer. So that's a developmental thing. You've got hair dye. Miss Clairol for red heifers. Okay. So the reason they're being sent
Temple Red 37.
So the reason why they're being sent, 5 red heifers is in case 4 of them have a white hair. That's why they're being sent 5 of them. But even if they are being sent 5, there's a limited lifespan to these things. I don't remember how. I think a heifer is a certain age of is it like 1 year or something like that? There's actually a technical definition of a heifer too. Yeah, a young female cow. Okay. At a certain point, these cease being heifers. If they're a mature cow, they're no longer a heifer. So, without the Temple Mount, this is useless. This is absolutely useless. So, I don't. It sounds to be like another publicity stunt by the Temple Institute. Honestly, that's what I think this is. I think this is yet another publicity stunt. And the Temple Institute does this. This is, I think, one of the things I don't like about the Temple Institute is it does generate a lot of money. People do donate gobs of money to the Temple Institute on the promise that someday it will be ready to inaugurate the third temple of the Lord. Well, they have to keep that interest alive. They got to keep that interest alive so people keep donating. This is why ABR keeps coming out with new discoveries. It's to keep the money flowing in. Temple Institute's no different. It's another shady religious organization that keeps doing these publicity stunts to bring the money in. So again, without the Temple platform, this is useless. This is useless. It has no effect. So anyway, that's what I think about the Temple Institute and the red heifers. So unless they get that Temple Mount, all bets are off. There's nothing here. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very interesting. I have kept track of them over the years. I've kind of lost recently interest in them just because it's like same old stuff. It's the same old stuff with them. But thank you for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Okay. Cataphracт3 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he asks, is Neopaganism, in your opinion, something original believers would have recognized like Egyptians or Greeks or Norse, or would they see it as strange? That's an easy one. They'd see it as strange. We have to really understand that Neopaganism is a 20th century it's a 20th century phenomena. most of these neo-pagan religions are reconstructed religions. Essentially, they are religions that have been, I would say, reconstructed from very scant details of the past. They're idealized. They're catering to modern sensibilities and modern practices. Like, for example, like modern druids. None of them practice the Wicker Man anymore. Sorry. Yeah, it's burning 5 people alive in a giant man made of wicker. Yeah,
Frowned upon by your neighbor.
it's sort of frowned upon, but nobody is practicing that anymore. You know, ancient druids also basically had their female priests tattooed and naked. Um, yeah, no one's really practicing that either. Yeah, so yes. Even say reconstructed neo-pagan Egyptian religions. Nothing. They are nothing like ancient religious practice. Okay? Basically Egyptian religion was a temple cult. They were temple cults. And they had sacred space, and they had idols, and there's Holy of Holies, and you had a sacred bark in the center of Holy of Holies, and there's a lot of apparatus, a lot of stuff, a lot of physical stuff that accompany their rituals. Most modern, say, reconstructed Egyptian religions don't do that. They just kind of play around with it. They don't practice it the way the Egyptians do. So the Egyptians wouldn't recognize this from. They'd look at this and go, "What are you doing? You're playing at religion." So I think this would be true of most ancient practitioners of these religions. They would look at, say, the modern counterpart and not recognize it. Really not recognize it. Now, this is not to say that they are invalid. Okay, because religions serve their own purposes in their own communities, perfectly fine, even when they're reconstructed. Okay, so there's validity in that. However, they're not the same. And they don't serve the same audiences, and they don't serve the same needs. I think if you did reconstruct these ancient religions totally accurately, they would not be a good fit with modern society. They wouldn't meet the needs of modern society, essentially. They are designed to meet the needs of ancient societies. So, they would see us as strange, and we'd see them as strange. We do see them as strange. And likewise, the reverse would be true as well. They would see us as strange. What? You worship only one God? What are you thinking? That was sort of the reaction the Romans had. Romans used to call Christians atheists because they only worshiped one God. They thought that was strange. For them, that was bizarre. There's no question that the view of who's strange would go both ways. We would see them as strange, and they would see us as strange. And the same would be true of those who reconstructed those religions as well. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate that. The Camelopard for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Question too expensive posted below. Okay. Let's see here. Oops. Okay. Get continued here. What I've been taught growing up about salvation for those who haven't heard the gospel seems to be not biblically supported. Could you explain how this works in 5 minutes or less? Oh, 5 minutes or less. That all. Yes, this is one of the most pressing missionary questions. Um, there's this is a debated topic, honestly. We're gonna get right into the nub of this. Is what happens to those who haven't heard the gospel? Now, there is a guiding principle here that nobody goes to hell for not knowing God, not knowing the gospel. People go to hell for rejecting God. So if you reject God, yeah, there's nowhere else for you to go. So salvation, we have to understand that the whole purpose of salvation is new life in Christ. It's new life in Christ. It's not just life after death. Some people are it's possible that some people are going to get life after death who didn't have new life in this life. Possible. How likely that is, that's something that's really debated. You know, this is not universalism, by the way. There's people who debate this topic on it's sometimes called second chance theory. Second chance theory is you didn't have the opportunity in this life, so you get a second chance, essentially, to decide which way you want to go, with God or against God. On one level, all have rejected God. All have rejected. But was that an informed decision? Is going to come down to that's how the debate's going to go. It's not that everyone hasn't rejected God. Everyone's rejected God. The question's going to come down to was that an informed decision? Is there grace given in the event that it wasn't an informed decision? If it wasn't an informed decision, and if there was grace, there is a possibility that it could happen. Now we're not told a lot about this, because there does seem to also be the fact that, yeah, even if you're rejecting God at one point, you may decide, once you hear the gospel, to accept it. Whereas if you hadn't heard the gospel, you might have just rejected it anyway. So there does seem to be an imperative there to spread the gospel, even if there might be a second chance. By spreading the gospel, those who would believe do believe. And if those who would believe didn't believe, that opens then up the door, to the possibility of the second chance. Sort of the second chance debate. So there again, we're operating here out of we're not really told what happens immediately upon death. To those who say, could have believed, but never had the opportunity. But again, we're functioning on the idea that God doesn't, throw people in hell for ignorance. People throw themselves into hell for rejecting God. Yeah. God doesn't want anyone to perish. That's the other thing too. God wants no one to perish. He wants all people to come to salvation. That's not to say all will. In fact, we're told that there are those who won't. They'll refuse. Some people just don't want God under any circumstances. So that's how I would explain it in 5 minutes or less. It is an open debate. It is debated. I don't. Yeah, it is a topic that is often discussed in Christian theological circles, and amongst missionaries. Okay, so it is a concern because we don't know for sure. We don't know, just plainly don't know for sure. Is it possible that those who didn't hear could believe? Yeah, possible. The Bible doesn't exclude it. Doesn't exclude the possibility entirely. Okay, but it does say that after death is the judgment. So whatever that judgment is, we're not really told. But again, it's an open debate. People are discussing it, and I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat, and I very much appreciate it. It looks like we're starting to get to the end of the super chats here. Last one. Just hit the 3-hour mark. Keep telling Kiara here that someday we're gonna quit before 3 hours. Yeah. Okay. You've answered the question in 5 minutes. Well, thank you. We tried. Okay, well let's look at our poll here before we get to the last couple non-super chats. And the poll. And here we have it. Okay. Now, our poll. This is the first time we've done a poll in the live chat. We're considering a Mr. Empty Conjecture show explaining Egyptian biblical speculation. So we would do topics, that are very speculative, where maybe the answer isn't clear. There's various topics or various opinions. And we asked our viewers, would this interest you? And we had 81 votes. Charlie, don't serve. Please, please, please do it. The 3 options were awesome, bring on the popcorn, don't care, just answer my question, nah, I hate that dirty sock. 95% said, awesome, bring on the popcorn. Well, I think our viewers have spoken. 3% don't care. Nah, I hate the dirty sock. 1%. So, there you go. Our first. Will there only be? Let's see. Will there only be Mr. EC on the screen? We haven't decided yet. This is just an idea that came to us. Somebody asked us to do a a Monday video discussing speculation around a certain topic. And it's like, it wants us to explore all the sort of loony theories associated with it. And so it's like, well, this is sort of, the territory of Mr. Empty Conjecture. How would our audience feel about a Mr. Empty Conjecture show? So I can sort of see where it's going here. I'm already prepared with popcorn. Me too. So I think I've got might understand how my audience feels about this. So Okay, let's take a couple more non-super chats and we'll call it a night because I'm starting to get tired here. So, I'm gonna take a couple here from the Bible Exegete. What is your opinion about Biblical Archaeology Review Bar Magazine? Okay. My opinion of them is sometimes they have some really good scholars who will come in and write for them. You know, there's been some excellent scholars who have written for Bar. Kenneth Kitchen has written for Bar. Alan Millard has written for Bar. William Deaver has written for Bar. I've written for Bar. Okay, so I do have a high regard for Bar in some cases. Now, I don't have a high regard for their advertising. They've got some pretty shady people advertising in that magazine. Okay, but it has attracted some really good authors. And there has been some very good articles in Bar. So this is one of those eat the meat, spit out the bones kind of deals. So don't buy any of the products in the advertising, but it can be actually I mean, it's a pretty good lay magazine for archaeology. Sometimes it will go onto those sensationalist topics, and that can be problematic. That can distract away from serious archaeological work. So there have been times that it's really sort of crossed that line. But it's also had some good stuff in it too. So not the best, not the worst, you know. It's accessible. It's very accessible to the lay reader. So I think that's very important right there. Is it does bring some archaeology and make it more accessible to basically, more general audience. So I like it for that. I like it for that. I just wish sometimes it didn't go over the top on the sensational topics. Okay, so thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it. The second question he has here. Now, I don't know what he means here exactly by this. How reliable is the petrographic investigation of the Amarna tablets? What do you mean by petrographic investigation? I don't know what you mean by this. This is not a term you normally see when it regards um, clay tablets and inscriptions. Okay, so I don't know what you mean by this. So if you could please explain that a bit, a bit more, because I'd love to talk about the Amarna tablets. The Amarna tablets are really cool. I think the Amarna tablets are one of the most important historical sources we have from. I see what you get. The analysis of the clay's origin. Um, well, here's the thing. The tablets are from all over the Mid East, ancient Near East. Okay. Okay. So he's basically saying where the clay came from. Yeah, you find them all over the ancient Near East. I haven't seen any reports specifically about the origin of the clay of those tablets. The fact is, we don't really, in some respects, don't need to know that much about them. I mean, they might help us dial down some of the locations, but many times we know where those tablets came from because they mention what city they're from. Whether it's Babylon, whether it's from Hattusas. There's a lot of those tablets are already well provenanced because they self-identify their city of origin, their place of origin. So, uh, okay. I'll take this too here. How, if it was burned, temperature was it heated? Most of these tablets were not burned. Okay, most of them were basically dried. So they're dried clay. They're not burned. So most of the Amarna tablets were not fired. Now, the practice of cuneiform tablets is generally that they were unfired. They're basically inscribed, allowed to dry harden, and then sort of shipped off after that. So we don't actually find a whole lot of ones that are basically the cuneiform tablets we find that are basically baked have usually been as a result of a temple fire. Like I think it was at the Temple of Shemesh that there were some fire tablets, but that was thought to be the result of the actual temple itself being set on fire, not because they were meant to be that way. And the clay tablets that we find at Amarna weren't fired. They're basically mud, basically tablets that had been, just dried mud. So, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. We do have another super chat just come in from Russ Hardy for $1.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is your best example of the Trinity in the Old Testament? Okay. Now, we got to be careful here about what we mean by Trinity here. Because there isn't an example in the Old Testament that mentions all three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But at the same time, too, the Father and the Holy Spirit had broader acceptance in early Judaism than the Son did. So you do find texts, Second Temple period texts, that talk about God the Father and the Spirit of God as being both God, persons of God. So we do find some basically diunity texts, but the kicker is always going to be basically what is the divine status of the Son. And I think the best text for this is, I believe it's Isaiah 44:6. Let's make sure I've got the right one here. There are several good passages in Isaiah. Yeah, but it's 44:6, and I'll bring this up. Isaiah 44:6. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first, I am the last, and there is no God beside me. Okay. What I like about this passage is a number of things. First, it mentions two persons. Okay. Thus says the Lord, King of Israel, Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, King of Israel. And then it follows with a possessive, his Redeemer. Whose Redeemer? Yahweh's. Okay. His Redeemer. Well, that's messianic. We know that's Messiah, because he is the lamb that takes away the sin of the world, that redeems the world. But I identifies him as the Yahweh of hosts. Okay? So you have one person, Yahweh, followed by a who's King of Israel, and a second person who is a Redeemer, the possessive of the first, also called Yahweh of hosts. So two Yahwehs. And they both say in unison, I, singular, am the first, I am the last, and there is no God besides me. I think that is the strongest, the best example of, say, a Trinitarian passage in the Old Testament. Now, after this, you have to go to, say, the New Testament to get, say, a fuller version of the Trinity. You're not going to find the Trinity in one verse, even in the New Testament. Yes, you'll find the Great Commission. Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But to see that Spirit as God, you have to kind of go to Acts chapter 5, verses 3 to 4, to see the Spirit also called, say, God, and being a person. So you take these two passages together, and you got yourself a Trinity easily, and it's very, very hard to refute. So when you do look for, say, passages on the Trinity, you really have to look at who are the person. Is it referring to a person? Is this person Yahweh? Is it God? And what's the relationship going on here? So that's so there's really the whole sort of issue going on here of you're not going to find a Trinity in just one verse, but you are going to find it sort of spread out, and you've got to have that perspective. But that's the closest. That's probably the most. That's probably the strongest Trinitarian passage you're going to find in the Old Testament, right there in Isaiah 44:6. And again, it's only talking about two of the persons. But if you got those two persons, the Holy Spirit is that's sort of easy to add on after. Okay, and I don't mean that adding on to the Trinity, but you know, that's less controversial. That's not controversial. Once you've got the Father is God and the Son is God and they're one person and they're one God, then you've got everything you need then to take that next step to the Spirit being God is a foregone conclusion, pretty much. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answers your question. It's a good question. Unfortunately, it's not one that you can answer with just one verse, but this is as close as it gets. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Now we just got a super sticker. Wow. Awesome. From Sharp Spear for $2. Wow. Thank you very much for the it's either a super sticker or it's a super chat without a question. Either way, thank you very much. If you have a question, do throw it in. We'll try to answer it in the time remaining. But really, really, very much appreciate the contribution. We want to thank all our people who give us super chats because you guys keep us going. Without you guys, it's really hard to make ends meet. So we very, very much appreciate all you do for us. We're so grateful for each and every contribution and every super chat. As I said, without this, it can be very, very difficult to do this. So we very, very much appreciate it, and we're so grateful. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more super chats, and then I'm going to call it a night. Gadiel Arellano. Dr. Falk, can you play some riffs with your guitar? No. Thank you for asking. See, anything else here? Uh... Ooh. Hmm. Okay, I'll take this one here from Warrior of the Most High. So, who would be the first victim of EC's new show? Oh boy. Well, well, while the popcorn keeps silent, we haven't decided yet if Mr. EC is going to be silent. He's got a big mouth. I mean, he's got a really big mouth, and he shoots his mouth off a lot. So, um, it's not going to be one of the things. It won't be one victim. It'll be many victims. Okay, so that's one of the things we kind of decided already that it's going to be more topical. So it'll pick a topic such as, well, how are the pyramids made? And then we examine all the serious and not so serious theories attached. So there could be potentially many, many targets or victims that fall to Mr. EC. So we haven't decided yet on the format or anything like that, but it probably won't be just one victim, like, for example, say the popcorn reviews are. Or even the, say, the mana machine alerts. This will be something different. This is going to be exploring speculations. Okay? So, thank you very much for the question, but, we've got yet to see more. I got another super chat here from Silegio for 50 Swedish kroners. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Good morning, Sweden awake now. 3 more hours incoming. Oh no. No. Not worth 3 more hours. Have mercy, please. In all seriousness, we are going to wrap this up soon because I am exhausted. So, but thank you very much for the super chat, even if you like tormenting me with them. All right. Saint Ronan asks, are you ever going to have a popcorn review again? Yes, we are. We have some more ideas for popcorn reviews. The popcorn always keeps its silence. Okay, popcorn never reveals when it's coming, who it's going after. Okay, so that's the popcorn, but more are coming. There's a couple of targets the popcorn has shown up on the popcorn's radar. We won't be doing them, though, until after my discussion with Titus Kennedy, which is going to be on Sean McDowell's channel, November 7th at 10:30 a.m. Okay? Pacific Standard Time or Daylight Time? That's Pacific Time. 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. So after we get done with that discussion, and I should actually put up another poll. I'll probably put this one up in the community tab. Because this is happening so early in the morning, I probably will not be doing a Monday release that day because it's happening on a Monday. So the question I was thinking of is, should we have an after party? I've never done an after party after an interview or a debate, but I'm thinking of possibly doing a evening show, an evening, kind of like this, kind of like an open Q&A, where we talk about that, discussion, and take some further questions if people want. So if there's interest there, I might put up a little poll later on in the week, or maybe next week, asking if people want an after show to that discussion. So Anyway. So anyway, there are more popcorn reviews coming. They will be coming out after November 7th. And we are thinking again of doing a after show possibly. Haven't decided yet, but we're thinking of doing an after show possibly after the debate or after the discussion to see if anyone wants any more questions answered. So anyway, thank you very much, and great question. Okay, we got a super sticker, I think, or a super chat from Jack Ray for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Thank you for your support. We really, really appreciate the support. We really relish all of these super chats. As I said, it keeps us afloat. It keeps us going, and we are so appreciative of it. Pressing question, important question. Maria Teresa Ramirez. What kind of popcorn do you prefer? Plain. With salt and butter. Lots and lots of butter. I don't get into flavored popcorns. There are some exceptions. Mrs. Falk loves caramel popcorn. Okay. I don't care for caramel. Occasionally, rarely, I'll put dried spices in my popcorn, in my buttered popcorn. Like I might put oregano or garlic powder. Get a garlic butter popcorn going. What? He's I was gonna dream of garlic popcorn tonight. Yeah, sometimes sometimes I'll put like spices in my popcorn. But I generally don't. I generally love my popcorn just straight up. I actually do it very simply too. So my popcorn tends to be just in I have a pot. It's nothing fancy, just a stainless steel pot. A little bit of olive oil in the bottom. Throw in some popcorn and let it pop. It's watch it so it doesn't burn, and that's about it. So generally, my popcorn tastes are pretty simple. As I say, I tend to be a popcorn purist. So, okay, I'll take this question from Sharp Spear because he did give a super chat earlier on. And he asks, is Ham and Kemet the same? No, it's not. And did Egypt use the name Mitzrayim? Any books on the subject? Not per se. Egypt didn't use the name Mitzrayim. That is a common Semitic word for Mitzir. Is a common Semitic word for Egypt. But the Egyptians didn't use it themselves. They would use Kemet, the Black Land, or Tahwi, the Two Lands. So those are the most common monikers for Egypt that were used by Egyptians themselves. Okay. Ham and Kemet were not the same. Ham is one of the sons of Noah. The youngest of the sons. Kemet is just the Egyptian name for Egypt, and it's, as I said, it means the Black Land. And it opposes the opposite of Kemet is Deshret, which is the Red Land. So the Black Land means it's the fertile land. Because after the Egyptian Nile flooded every year, it left this black silt everywhere. That's where you knew where to plant. Because the black sand was the fertile area. Red land is the desert. Well, No, and the reason why it's not yellow, and even though you go out in the desert and you look, everything looks yellow. And I had an Egyptian army officer say that the only color you see in the desert is yellow. The Egyptians didn't view it as yellow. And the reason why they didn't view it as yellow is because they ascribed, they didn't have a name for yellow. They used Nebu, which means gold. Okay? So their association, the development of, say, the names of color change over time. From, very, very, I mean, you have the obvious black and white and ochre. Ochre is probably one of the, which would be red. It's one of the earliest colors. And yellow, maybe yellow ochre, maybe gold. But, in the case of Egypt, it ascribed yellow to the metal, whereas it kind of viewed the desert regions as more red. Now, this does make sense because you do look from the Nile Valley; it does have a reddish appearance. Okay, they're not going deep into the desert; they're seeing the Theban foothills. And the Theban foothills have a much more reddish appearance than they do a yellow appearance. So this all makes sense when you're actually down on the boots on the ground there. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. If you want to read basically on, say, general views on Egypt, this won't talk about Ham or say Misraim per se, but if you want to get more views on, say, a general view of Egypt, I would recommend, say, it's getting long in the tooth now, but Anatomy of a Civilization. That was a pretty good book on, say, Egyptian worldview. I forget who wrote it at the moment, but it's called Egypt Anatomy of a Civilization. I used to recommend that as a textbook for my classes too. So again, it's dated. It needs to be updated. Badly needs to be updated. It's really badly needs. But it was pretty good in its time. So that's where I would point you to start. General books by Ian Shaw are also very good, like the History of Ancient Egypt. It's an Oxford book. The Oxford History of Ancient Egypt is very good as well. So those will give you a start if you want to more on this topic. So anyway, thank you very much for that previous super chat, and thank you for the question. Okay, I think I will take just one more question, and then we'll call it a night, because there's a lot of non-super chats. Oh, let's see here. Scroll back. And if I don't see anything I like to answer, we'll just call it a night. I feel okay about having answered as many as I could. Doesn't look like I'm seeing anything more interesting. Nothing that's catching my fancy. I answered most of the ones that I think are really excellent questions. So, I think we will call it a then. So, anyway, I want to take this opportunity again to thank everyone who joined us tonight. We went for 3.5 hours. That is long enough. So anyway, I want to thank our super chatters who are basically keeping us afloat and keeping food on our table. Thank you so very much. We really, really appreciate it. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters who basically help provide equipment upgrades. We can't do it without you guys, so we really appreciate that. We also want to thank our regular viewers and our subscribers who basically keep the YouTube algorithm interested in our videos. Funny that. So, and we also want to thank everyone who joined us tonight with just a regular question and a comment. I go back after these live streams and I read every comment. So I read absolutely every comment. So I want to thank you all for participating tonight, because we can't do this without you. We enjoy having you here. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.